Hello, everybody, and welcome to Event Icons, where you get a chance to chat with the icons of the event industry. I'm Brant Kruger of Event Technology Consulting, and I'm excited to be joined today by Nick Borelli of Borelli Strategies. And today we are going to get really deep in there, folks, because we are going to be talking about behavioral science in event design. We've had some discussions about it offline, and I'm really excited about this topic, so let's get to it.
It's Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, so you know what that means. It's time for another episode of #Event Icons.
Presented by Endless Events.
The show where you get to ask the icons of the events industry anything.
Just go to www.event-icons.com to ask questions.
Our iconic guests will answer them live during the entire show. Before we get started, the more people we have watching, the better the conversation. So please help share #Event Icons
on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Just tell your friends to watch at www.event-icons.com.
Now, without any further delay, this is #Event Icons.
All right, everybody, it's time to talk behavioral science in events. We've talked about neuroscience in events. We've talked about how things like color and other things affect our attendees. Today, we're going to be talking about behavior, not only affecting and changing the behavior of our attendees, but how do we use this kind of, I don't know, Nick, would you call it a burgeoning science, behavioral science? I mean, it's been kind of around for a while, but maybe not necessarily applied to events.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the principles have been around for a very long time, and new principles are discovered all the time as they're tested by behavioral scientists. But applying it to live events is something that is pretty recent, and mostly due to the fact that we have a lot more data than we used to because of a lot of the outlets for data collection. And I think that, frankly, we've just become sophisticated enough as an industry to demand more. And this is really what the height of what events should be.
Well, and those of you who might not have listened for very long, Nick Borelli, he's been a friend of the show for a long time. You've been a multiple-time guest on Event Icons. President, strategist, Borelli Strategies, marketing consulting firm. You guys are offering events and event companies marketing consulting, resulting in increased ticket sales, stakeholder retention, all the good stuff there through your company, Borelli Strategies. Last we saw you, Nick, we were on our events trend episode number 143 at the end of last year. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is, honestly, it's a topic that I have become really, really passionate about, mostly because I believe I have the most to learn in this area. So I'm not coming at you with lots of PhD credentials. I am an event professional who's been in the events industry starting as a dishwasher at 14. I am just a sponge. And very passionate, and really and I don't know if I have not that many more skills, but this to me is the most exciting aspect of live events because, as we were talking about offline, events exist to change behavior. You know, that's why you have an event. If you don't need to change the behavior of the attendees, everyone might as well just stay home. There's some good streaming, outlets now. Televisions are nice and big. You got Uber Eats. There's really no reason to leave. If you want to change behaviors for any number of reasons, there's faith-based reasons. There's political reasons. There's educational reasons. There's any number of things that you would have a gathering for. And really, since the dawn of time, that's what gatherings were for. They were outcome-based. What's exciting about the behavioral sciences is that there are different ways that people are built. And because of that, because of things that they're subconsciously driven by or consciously driven by, if you want to change behaviors, you first have to intimately study people. And that's really all behavioral science is the study of people and what makes them tick. How do you motivate them? And how do you, in the behavioral science world, nudge them to the things that you'd want them to do?
And that there's so many fascinating, I can see how easily you got sucked down the rabbit hole in looking into this because, I just didn't casually, I like to kind of alternate between science fiction and then like business books and things like that in my Audible library, and just kind of incidentally have picked up a fair amount of this through, books like Thinking Fast and Slow, or books where we talk about how people make decisions, how we deal with things like probability. We're really, there's a lot of blurred lines between, the behavioral sciences and neurosciences and psychology and economics, and all of these things kind of come together in this one discipline. So I guess let's kind of dive in and start talking about some of the principles that you think we can apply when we start looking at behavioral science and events.
Sure. I mean, I'll give you an example that came up yesterday in conversation with a friend of mine who is has a marketing agency. We were about every month we get together, we have a beer, or I have a White Russian or something, and we have a discussion about what we're into and what we're doing. And I was unloading some of these ideas on him, and he said, "Give me an example of a behavioral science principle that actually has some kind of practical outlet." And I said, "Okay, how about the idea of survivor bias?" And he said, "What's that?" And I said, "Okay, have you ever had this phenomenon where you're leaning up against an old building and you say, you know what? They don't make them like they used to. This is rock solid. This is amazing. This is how buildings should be built." And that seems like a pretty benign and actual true statement. But the reality of it is that what you don't see all around you or all the other buildings from that era, and there's a reason, they were built poorly. There was no contracting disciplines. There was no, maintenance that was required. It was payola. It was a cousin. It was child labor. It was, patch it up and make it look good. But if you only judge things by the survivor, what you find is, you have an incomplete picture. So we were talking about focus groups. Now, I like to have focus groups at conferences and trade shows as an amazing stakeholder deliverable. Here's some ideas generated by people who represent your potential consumer base, and they can help you make some amazing decisions for your marketing, for your sales. I mean, as a thing to add on to a show that your presenting sponsors will get actual value out of versus just more logo placement, it's a great thing. And I said, if you put people in there who are their clients exclusively, you don't get the full picture because you don't have the people that said no. So when you build a focus group, you need to be able to have the types of people who would say yes or are your inside people. But then you also need some wild cards of people from a different perspective, because the people that said no give you the complete picture. So things like that, if you understand that is a thing that guides people, then you can start to say, oh, okay, there's these repeatable things that guide our actions. Another example would be irrational predictability. So the idea that the majority of your decisions are actually built on pretty irrational foundations. You trust, you have your gut. It seems like somebody who gets me. Shorthand, because you have these experiences and your subconscious and feelings of insidery and uses of words give you the decisions you need to move, because you have so much stimuli that you just, you have to be able to process things quickly. But you don't actually look at numbers to say, well, this is a 5 and this is a 6. I'm going to go with the 6 all the time. So from a marketing perspective, if you're trying to sell more tickets, how do you reach people who make their decisions based on, irrational behaviors? And the answer is that most people do it in a predictable way, the way they do it. So finding the rules for every person's irrational choice making, once you define that, then you've cracked it. Because if you just try to go at them with features and benefits and not emotions and the whys and all this stuff, that you'll never reach them. But if you figure out what emotions you need to trigger within their irrational choice making, then you have the ability to connect.
And just to clarify, you're not saying that there's one set of rules for everybody. You're saying that that's part of what you have to figure out, right? Is that
Correct.
There's a different set of rules. There is a set of rules for each type of person.
The good news is there is a set of rules. The bad news is there's 6 billion sets of rules.
Exactly.
But not really. What you find out is actually there's a number of archetypal rules, right? So offline, we were talking a little bit about some of these types of design principles that you can use in your events. So one I really enjoy a lot as a marketer, and also I think where it connects with what you do as well, is the idea of storytelling. You know, giving people bullet points and saying memorize this does not change behavior. You know, what changes behavior is making people feel something. That's why you see all of this kind of virtual or virtue-based advertising in the marketplace currently of your Nikes and your razor companies, et cetera. They could just say our razor has 6 blades instead of 5 now, and then just keep adding blades ad infinitum.
11 blades.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I just saw an ad actually that, like, their big selling feature is they're a single blade, and I'm like, oh,
right.
it's going back because there's nowhere else to go,
Right.
you know. And then the dual blade will be probably the best after that. So we are. I mean, there's a book, I forget the name of it. I'll have to do some research. But somebody was explaining to me the idea that we actually evolutionarily splintered because of storytelling. It was our ability to, you know, everyone knows how to build a fire, and everyone knew how to evade the predator. Not because they said, here's the 7 ways to evade a predator. It's like when you feel these hairs on the back of your neck, like the time where my grandfather, the stories actually allowed us to be able to evolve. And really, it's just ingrained in us at every level. Well, we know that, but if you incorporate like behavioral science, you understand that there's different levels to that, and there's different ways to integrate key messaging. But if you are doing it in a way that is only about information and not that meat, you know, the sizzle a little bit too, then what you have is points that are not resonating. And if it's a sales pitch, if it's a conference keynote, if it is award ceremony. I mean, an award ceremony where they say the winner is, you know, blank, here's a picture of what they did, versus, which, by the way, those are the events I like the least, because I find that like they're only good for like 30 people of 300. Right. But if you put the client on a video, yeah, and they were to tell the story about how they, you know, how they were moved by the work of the person who worked on that, you know, I always default to the event industry, you know, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, or like if it was a nonprofit. I mean, they get that, right? Like if you've been at nonprofit events, they're not saying we saved, and then they just like have little pictures of a million, like icons of like 67 people. No, they have one of them tell about their lives, and everyone's like, how many zeros should I write in this check? You know, they get that because it's visceral. But, you know, the storytelling principle is something that can be put into anything.
Absolutely. I mean, and you even did it in the introduction. You know, I'm going to remember the kind of the theory of the survivor, because I have this vision of leaning up against a building and, you know, really think, you know, because, you know, you made it into more of a story rather than just let me explain the principles of design, you know, that kind of thing. We have a lot to overcome to memorize those kind of things, but right. Your retention ability for you to pass a story to a story to a story is there. So that's a principle where, I mean, honestly, it's not more complicated than that, but it can be, and you can get into emotional marks in an arc of a story. You can learn pitch methodologies, of which there are many. I'm a big fan of the Pixar pitch methodology, but there's innumerable amount of those in order to templatize the idea of hitting the marks of a good story. Usually it's details that aren't important, but that activate senses, you know, touch, feel, sense. Even I said touch a building, I had to incorporate some sort of sensory in there because it puts you in that position. So, you know, when you're trying to work on your keynote for your conference, or if you're trying to, figure out a way to any number of ways to communicate behavioral change to people, it's really a good discipline to understand that. And that's, you know, there's a ton of these principles. I'm trying to think of like one that's really good. So I used one called authority. So, you know,
turns out we tend to believe people with credentials in positions where they are fitting norms of heights of power, and if they are delivering messages from their pulpit of authority. That it's something that we just all kind of lock into because, well, at one point we were all kids, and that's a thing that is ingrained in us. The idea of that for event marketing, for instance, I like it when the CEO of an organization is at their desk and there's a video of them explaining to you why this year is an important year to attend. Now, you could have the coolest, hippest person on the skateboard do it, and there's some ideologies around that, and you could have just a generic voice or an MC or that kind of thing. But when you use the pulpit of authority, there's a certain number of people who gravitate to that because they're like, oh, geez, this year must be a big deal. And also, conversely, if you don't do that, then it's not a big deal, right? So.
Right. And to be clear, the person on the skateboard could be the authority in the right situation.
Oh, well,
I mean, if it's the right kind of event and the right set of situation, that could be the person, the voice of authority.
Esports, the authorities are completely different because their community is so closed off and insidery. I mean, all of them are. Every association, woodworking associations, or everything is. That one isn't a one that because if you're not in that group in that generation, and because it's such an emerging thing, playing in that, it has really taught me that wow, they're really guarded and should be of their communities because. They've built something kind of like a Galapagos Islands of events. They had an evolution off to the side somewhere else, and they've evolved differently, and they're protective of that. So you're right, and if anything, that potentially is a bridge to getting into the main way I use these kinds of behavioral insights, which is the building of personas.
I want to give you an opportunity to get in that, but before we go down that rabbit hole, just for one more second on authority, just to kind of illustrate. I know it seems like one of those like, oh yeah, so what? Who big deal, But I mean, there's so many examples out there where people do actually respond in these ways, and I know you, just from knowing you personally, that you like to do little kind of like people hacks, where you're actually using techniques to get things or get I don't know, hotel upgrades, things like that, and just there's all kinds of evidence that if you just have extra letters after your name, that lends credibility, that lends things. I've known people that have recommended. I'm not saying that you should do any of these things. I'm just saying that these are examples of where it works. Audience,
it does.
Settle down.
A thing.
Yeah. Having laurels, on your event site that say 2017 winner of whatever best event. It doesn't matter who gave it to you. It doesn't matter where it came from. We see those things and we go, oh yeah, that's, I'm not suggesting that you lie. I'm just saying that people respond to those.
There's plenty of them.
Yes,
so, I mean,
you
can
plenty
find
of
them.
those types of things that we are susceptible to these types of things. Before we go into the personas, I want to ask you about another one of the principles that we kind of mentioned earlier when we were discussing this off the air, is the idea of not only respecting the authority of our authority figures, but also kind of that idea of when that's not around, looking to kind of the social proof, right? Like that when we're doing something new or unfamiliar, that we're going to follow the people that we think are similar to us. I mean, this is the whole idea behind influencers, right? Is that we either aspire to be those people or we think we're just like those people. And then we want to do the same things that that they do, go to the same events that they do. Can you expand a little bit more on that kind of social dynamic?
Yeah, honestly, that area is on the rise, mostly because individualism is on a rise in an exponential way. The fact that you can produce this show without having to go to a major television network and asking for airtime as you would have 20 years ago is an unprecedented amount of individualism you have. And because of that, fractured identities and because of fractured identities, you have more and more niche identities, and because of that, you have closer tribal bonds than have existed for a very long period of time. Everything was all in there was 3 campfires, network television, and that was it, right? And we were around one of the 3 campfires. Now there's infinite, there's people who are not watching TV right now and watching us, that's something that they couldn't go down to the grocery store and say, did you see the last episode of Event Icons to some, grandma? Maybe,
Right.
I don't know all grandmas, but certainly kids maybe aren't as interested in us. Mine aren't. Yeah, I think the idea of shared identity as a behavior is at a really, really high peak now, because of this ability to go super niche. And we have abilities to see psychographics that show the types of people who are likely to come across. I mean, a behavioral science what do you call it? Experiment is, if you are in a crowded room networking and somebody far away from you says your name, you can hear it and you can hone in on it. You go, who said that? And you can that's really straightforward. That's your name. Your identity it's one of one. But if you were to say certain things that you tribally connect to, you can hear that and filter through that very in a real way, in an actual physical room. Like if someone were to say far away from me in a busy room, Batman, Superman, say those words, I'd be like, whatever. There's a billion people in the world know that. But if you were to say like Detective Comics 27, or if you were to say like Jason Todd, like insidery comic book things that I only, that people would at that level would get, I would hear it. I would hone in it. I would lock in it. And my chances for connection would be higher. Same thing when you're talking about messaging. To know those trigger words within a community, so you have the shared identity that you can then pull upon, is a really powerful thing. But it first takes a good ear, and that's to understand how to leverage shared identity. You have to first start with listening, which a lot of these things really are that. A lot of behavioral science is the product of experiments, but we can do experiments in our events. I mean, it doesn't have to sound like, it's not beakers and
Right.
and
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
like
It's
that.
A/B testing, and if you
Not
reword
even
it
as complicated as that. Like, I was in Las Vegas. I've 3 years in a row. I've done this. I've gone to the MGM Lion. I think I may have told you this. I may not have. The Love Sign in Palazzo. The Oversized Shoes in Cosmopolitan. And what I've done is I've taken photos. I have a Dropbox of these of 3 years, and I've taken photos of who takes. Taking pictures of people taking pictures, which is admittedly creepy. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to see who's taking the pictures, how they're taking the pictures, and why they're taking the pictures. Because I'm very interested in architecture and props, and how people use them as a launching point to tell their own stories. Because I think that, like, well-designed events empower people through context to tell their own story, not telling the story of the brand or the stakeholders. However, if there's alignment with shared values that would play into the shared identity, then you would come along. The stakeholders would come along. But because of this rampant individualism, and because people don't want to take a picture of the presenting sponsor's logo on a banner to tell their family about, they don't do that, right? But if you connected with them emotionally and also had shared values, they would take your message along with them. But they're ultimately the star. And so you can do experiments like this. I urge people, if you have the ability to at your events where you're not running around like a crazy person, or find someone else, have someone watch your events, have people do experience audits. It's really fascinating, and you can set parameters. So like, I was looking at those people taking those photos, and I was saying, okay, what are people above 50 doing? What are people from, I'm guessing from this country or that country doing more often? And I found different results, and that told me things as far as how I'd be able to then, learn from that for messaging purposes, which is a lot of why live events happen, is the amplification of messaging.
I think there's a lot of things to unpack there, but I mean, one of the key.
It's all connected.
Yeah, it is. It is all connected. And I think that's, I mean, the number of times that I've seen someone who's dedicated to just sitting back and watching is so few. So
It's
few.
very few.
Because the planner is always running around trying to put out this fire or that fire, or this sponsor's not happy, or this boss isn't happy.
Do you know who's good at it? People in hospitality are good at it. Now, they come from a very specific filter, but there usually is someone on staff who is an eyes up manager as opposed to an eyes down. and they're looking specifically for hospitality traits. But they do have that sense of, someone has that sense. Maybe it's a superfluous manager who is just there to run the building, etc. But I've seen it there. But you're right. It is a valuable use of time that if you can't do it yourself, you should put someone else on it if you create the parameters for them.
I'll throw one more out there is honestly, your AV crew. We sit in the back of the room, and you know who else sits in the back of the room? The people who don't care. And you're really going to put your finger on the pulse of the downside of your audience in the back of the room.
That's a really good point. When were people on their phones? When were people?
Exactly. Because again, back of the room, you're going to see all those phone lights as people. You can see when people tune out. You can see when they start to get fidgety and start running to the restrooms. And maybe just having a conversation with the folks in the back of the room who, once you get past the flashy video and the awards lighting, are for the most part just kind of sitting there. They might have some interesting insights for you.
That's an interesting play. And conversely, if anyone's listening in the AV world, consider offering that as an option and saying, hey, what we could do potentially is give us 3 things to look for, and we'll tell you when they happen, more often than not. I mean, there was I was in Estonia a couple weeks ago, and there was a number of speakers. We were actually in the middle of the Baltic on a cruise doing this, a bunch of presentations and then awards. There was one person who came on. They're like, okay, well, I'm not going to be talking about the kind of touchy-feely big picture stuff with things with lots of pictures. I'm going to talk about deep data. And I watched as people were just rolling away and getting coffee. And I was like, oh, that was a trigger word for that audience not to say. It was
deep data.
They were Pavlovian in their response. Although maybe reverse Pavlovian. I don't know if that's a position.
right. Anti-Pavlovian.
Yeah, anti-Pavlovian. So I was like, I made a mental note of that in this group. At this time, based on that order of it was too much, and but it was a word that made them all go, I need to get out of here. And you could make a note of that and apply that to design in the future and get better, or you could not be aware and not take advantage of it. So a lot of this is, there's deep science that you can go down an infinite rabbit hole on it. There's also an awareness and paying attention that will change everything. Spend 2 weeks on one of these, a principle, of authority or of shared values, and say, okay, I'm going to listen in meetings from this point on of where we can apply more storytelling or more this. And then, like any other behavior, you might be able to modify your own behavior to adapt these things as things that you can take on.
Well, and that leads us back to where I know you wanted to go, which is, we're talking about these rules, right? And figuring out the rules. Is one of the ways to do that getting into personas and figuring out what those kind of data sets, what those rule sets are for each one of those personas, or am I misusing the terminology?
No, you're not. They are components of that. For sure. I believe they're extremely the practical results of that. Because in a practical sense, there's only so many goals that you would have when building an event, and usually impact is one of them. So it's going to have to be about a delegate participant increase in volume or quality. And at that point, you have to understand who they are in order to give them that, or retention, I suppose, is the other animal. So if you don't know who is there, you have no ability to interact with that. You'll end up trying to force down this generic vanilla messaging that sort of applies to everyone. But again, you wouldn't hear it across the room. And that's what you need to be able to do, especially with as many outlets there are for content delivery these days. You need to be able to resonate with people in a deeper way. And you can't do that unless you know them. They have to be in your head, and you have to be in their heads. And oftentimes, there's the hackneyed persona, which is fine. It's a place to start, of the alliterations and the names and they end up being a lot more, I find, the kind of not the initial level end up being a lot more segments really than personas. And admittedly, that might, yeah, exactly,
It'd be like a
demographics.
demographic. It's like Ethan Evans is a
CEOs are all
Yeah.
like, and directors are all like, and it's like, that's not true. And also, people don't make decisions based on their identity as a CEO. That's just not a behavioral type. So getting away, now that said, personas oftentimes lean heavier into certain segments more than others. To give you an example of like a thought leader type, right, where their behavior is based on trying to have achievement, supremacy, and the thirst for knowledge. Well, those people are rarely mopping floors. You know, they may have at one point, but they're driven to, you know, extremes on the end. So people in visionary roles often gravitate towards positions in the C-suite. So I'm not saying all C-suite people are like that. There's a bunch of different types, but many of the people within this behavioral structure end up being pulled from that segment. Does that make sense of the hierarchy?
Yeah.
So there is a relation there, and that's where I think the confusion happens of trying to attack segmentation and attack demographics as a way to do that. But the reality is that it's not how you nudge people into directions. It's actually it's nothing really. It's more facts and figures and not enough storytelling that connects with people. You have to know what their pains are, and to do that, the most important principle to apply is empathy. Like a persona that is brought up often when dealing with discovery with clients is the idea of the person who attends the conference because they found a way to take a vacation on the company dime. And that's a real occurrence.
Yeah.
And, you know, we've met those people, right? We've seen them. They're there, and they bounce. So they're not even retained necessarily. They're definitely not loyalists. Now, you don't not want those people unless you're really deciding that doesn't fit your culture. And look, there's a possibility there. There's the idea of negative personas, the people that are the people that aren't your people, and identifying those people as to not attract them isn't actually it's a strategy. But my take on it, applying empathy, is, well, why do they feel the need to do that? Why do they feel the need to go to this conference in New Orleans to spend as much time as they possibly can on Bourbon Street? And that's their ROI is not based on any of the things that I would list in my top 10 reasons. Empathetically, I would say, if I really can put myself in their shoes, they're probably abused 363 days out of the year. You know, they have a workload that's double somebody else's, and they need a pressure release. They need to recharge. But potentially there's an opportunity to elevate there where they need to connect with why they do what they did in the first place. And that's where you can start saying, okay, how do I attack someone who's in a position of needing to recharge? Because we can identify with that, right? Not necessarily maybe the idea of exploitative excuses to attend a show, but we can identify with the need that there is ebb and flow in our energy levels throughout the year where a live experience can recharge us. So if you do that and you understand that those are behaviors that people have, and you can empathetically put yourself in their shoes, you have the ability to then start marketing, and then, you know, hopefully not in a silo, work on the design that complements that need. And that's just one. I mean, you have as many personas as you can handle. You know, you don't want to have too many, you don't want to have too few. And it's always easy to split personas, to kind of go with some big arch ones first and find the ones and focus on the ones that have the least in common with each other. Because there's no point in a Venn diagram of your event being the circle to have two that are, you know, right on top of each other, unless you have so many other ones that you already have hammered out. So you kind of want the extremes.
Exactly. I mean, and we've been having some design focused episodes lately, just by coincidence of the way the schedule has worked out. And, you know, I'm guessing by the way that you're talking, you're not talking about the planning team sitting down and coming up with these personas necessarily. That might not be the best way to do it. And some of the suggestions that have been made on one of the other episodes is it's great to have personas, but you don't just sit down and come up with them. I mean, your team, you need to actually talk to people.
Yes.
And actually get to know them. So what process do you use to kind of help your clients come up with these personas, and how do you get to the people that you need to talk to?
Yeah, so I have the opportunity to work with Merritt's Global Events, and we have a discovery process that begets action for design called Design Studio, and it is an in-person meeting that is a little bit of it could be as many as, like, let's say 3 days, but really it's a dinner or something to get to know people, to get that out of the way, a full day's worth of discovery, and then a follow-up meeting based on actions of what we had time to sleep on things. In that core time, the questions are lots and lots of behavior-based questions and an understanding of the landscape of the communities that you're trying to attack. So where is there the most potential? Where's the most pushback? What makes these people excited? What makes them not excited? And the next level version of that, if you have the ability to, would be to actually bring them into the room and have avatars of these people in there too. Sometimes you're not ready for that because you haven't really made the initial movements. I find that that's a good year 2 thing to do, because year 1 really is about hypothesis, and you can test it once you actually can know who to identify. It's very difficult going in to try to identify people at first, but it's possible. And you go through exercises where you try to delineate what are the most important people to go after. But from the design perspective, you first need to have an organizing principle. And most people are aware, in the live events industry, are aware of the theme, which is kind of the attendee participant facing version of an organizing principle. An organizing principle can exist and generally does in a way that the attendee has no idea about it. Why are you having this event this year? Okay, let's start from scratch. This event's been going on for 70 years. That's great. Do we need this year? And ask that question. Does this event need to happen? Or is there a deficit in lives that this is filling? Okay, what is it? And what else is out there? And what are we doing that other people can? What do we have an authority in? And really just throwing out all the preconceived, running on autopilot stuff and starting from scratch. What is this? And what is this now in the face of what type of disruption is likely down the road, what people need in their lives to make it better? And you have to really to do that. And an organized principle is usually about 1 or 2 words. And that empowers you to say no to things. Does it fit that, this, that? No, then it's out. Actually, no, we're not actually living up to this. So we need to, do more of that. That concise guiding principle it's extremely important. With that, then you try to find the people who would be attracted to it.
It consistently blows my mind how often people on this show say exactly that we have to look for the why. We have to understand the why. Do we even need to be doing this event? Should we be doing this event? Are we succeeding? Having those initial steps. But then what's so funny to me is how often in the real world, I don't hear that, right? Once we get out into practice world.
Sure.
Agreed. Yeah.
There's a couple reasons for that. One, already established organizations that have, you'd have to get them to completely, dismantle their egos and do that, even though they've built something that, isn't broken, so to speak. Then you have to fight the entrepreneurial mindset, which is not, I don't believe, necessarily congruent with this, which says, I see a hole in the market and I can fill it. And that's the genesis. That's the organizing principle. But it's not good enough. That is not a sustainable enough core to attract a community that will, like you were talking about with influencers, that people will take up your flag and wave it too, that aren't on your team, because they're part of a community that believes in it. I mean, if like RuPaul's Drag Con, as an example, the app for that, somebody I know runs the company for the app for that. They've never deleted that app off their phones. Those people, it's a vibrant community that goes on. I mean, immediately in the airport, I'm deleting the app of the conference I'm going to because I don't need it anymore. But they've created an event that their community has never had as a galvanizing space of acceptance and evolution and growth, that it is important. And most events don't meet that watermark for me. To your point, I think that the market has always been soft, and it's never going to be as soft as it is today. It's going to be harder and harder and harder as more money, as more behavioral change is being able to be proven at live events. More investments will come, and that's why there's so many acquisitions, because there's money out there. So I mean, if it's working now, that's great. It will not work without some kind of cause, and that's what, like, I had the opportunity to attend a PCMA meeting a couple weeks ago with Greg Bogue speaking, and he said, and we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but the idea of the evolution of live events. You had your parties, then you had your special events, mid 70s to mid 2000s. Maybe I'm being a little cynical, but maybe I'm not, where it's just an event with a little bit of accoutrements enough, and logistics were the main emphasis, that we have rock solid logistics. And then it evolved into experiential, which it went from buzzword to minimal given. It was like, oh, well, what makes your event different? It's experiential. And there was a number of years where you could lean on that. And now it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm talking to you, so of course it is. And it's, it's a given. So there has to be, again, another bar to raise. And Greg was, his research has told him that the next level is broadcasting your message in order to, galvanize around a cause. If your event doesn't have a cause, it's not at the level of it needs to be. And there's certain events where that's super obvious, political, again, faith-based, all that stuff. It's like, that's really obvious. But like, what's your dentist, your actuary conference? What's their cause? Well, there has to be something that you have a line in the sand about. And if you don't draw that line of, we're about that, because that's important to us, you will not make the connections required to make people self-identify with it as something that is vital to their needs. And if you can't do that, well, we're the All Things to All People conference in the world of dentistry. Well, okay, but someone is going to lock into a tribe that is really about something in a much truer, more straightforward way, that will be loyal to that and abandon your generalist idea. That's the next, as he says, it's the next plateau at beyond experiential, is this cause-based idea, which I think is really cool, because it elevates a soccer match to be about, maybe it's a women's soccer match. It's about, breaking the glass ceiling. It could just be a sporting event, or it could be, this kind of movement of empowerment. It doesn't have to stop at just being a bit of sport where people are sweating and running around. It can be about something bigger, as an analogy, or what have you, but it has to be something that you self-identify with, as, again, individualism has become so ingrained in us because we all have platforms and we all think we're, Hollywood stars.
It occurs to me that the question that gets asked even less often than should we be doing this event is, what is our organization for? I mean, why do we exist? What is the purpose of this organization? So many associations, and you and I both do a lot of work with associations.
Yeah.
And I find myself asking that question. What do you do? What is the purpose of your organization, and why are you here? And, so reevaluating your events in this way, designing your events using this kind of, behavioral science is the term, but it feels so much deeper than that. Like, that doesn't seem to be an adequate bucket for what we're talking about today. Really forces you to take a look inward, I think, in a good way. That if you're using these design principles and you're doing it in a way that's going to truly improve your event, you're going to improve your organization as a whole along the way.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about personas as their obvious outlet being for marketing. You know, I can say, okay, here's how I segment emails and create landing pages and advertising, etc. And that's the trappings of it. But I'll be honest that, you know, I do this for associations often, and it's so, I mean, that if that's how you're using it exclusively, you are not understanding its full potential. You know, you should, you know, you should have these people at an organizational level. They should be telling you what you should be doing. um, it's why I like the idea of influencers so much. I don't like influencers solely as mouthpieces to, you know, post Instagram pictures. That's just nothing. I like to actually listen to tastemakers and ask them questions, because their authenticity and their resonance has been built in some sort of truth, in a way that it isn't about, you know, well, this association's been here for 100 years. Like they had the same, you know, they were born the same as everybody else, and they acquired over time this authenticity that they built in an organic way. I want to know why, and I want to know, you know, how they're built in order to create a diverse group of those people to guide, and see if I can have an organization that can provide them the things they need to reach their full potential. But if I'm not, you know, that doesn't necessarily scale to talk to all the members you know, at once. But as representatives of that, you have a huge potential. And again, you could create this authority within them because they've created their own authority. So it can, like, you can still use behavioral science in that fashion. It is a bit of shared identity. It is a bit of authority. It gets to shared identity and it crests to a point of authority organically because they've, you know, they've built this, and because there's some, like, maybe metrics of vanity metrics behind them of followers or something else, or, you know, other authorities that have given way to, you know, working with them, so they get the you know, the uh, power of that authority on top of what they're doing. But it's all these things, they, when they converge, you can kind of see them, and that's where, you know, there's a lot of value. um, but yeah, you're right, it's bigger than, I mean, it should be bigger than marketing. It should definitely be bigger, you know, than that. And it could be bigger than your event, depending on what your, you know, what your mandate is. If you're bigger than an event, if event is part of what you are, if you're a corporate entity and you're looking at product launches and you want to sell more tickets, well, these are the people that would come. But more importantly, who are the people that buy your product? You know, who buys the BMW? Like I did. I worked on an RFP for Ferrari, and they wanted a social media strategy for an experiential launch. And I said, okay, no problem. Let me start doing some creeping and social listening and such, and some questions with people who own Ferraris, and kind of figure it out. And what I found is that they don't care about hashtags. You know, they're not necessarily out there, you know, oversharing. And in fact, there's actually a detrimental way to do that. They're clearly or likely closer to the 1%, and they don't want to necessarily rub that in everyone's faces. But if they're in a group amongst themselves, they're very safe in doing that, and that's cool. So I propose the creation of a Ferrari social media that is something that you only have access to with your VIN number. Um, because they do care about their tribe, but they don't necessarily want to brag about or really hear about the rest of the world. So getting them to broadcast your message, it's not going to happen. But you can speak to them more directly in a closed room. Things like that, like you have to kind of know somebody or pay attention or listen to somebody in that world of someone that's like, oh, I went to school in Boston. Oh, did you? And they bring it up at every once in a while. You're like, I get it. You're like signaling me that you went to Harvard. Or the people that put the keychain with the logo, you know, you're like, I get it. You know, like they're subtle, but you have to kind of know those behaviors in order to draw upon them. And it really takes the event professional, if they really want to reach their full potential, you have to be in touch with humanity. You have to listen, you have to watch, and you have to, you know, while you don't have to watch every episode of Game of Thrones, you should have to understand maybe why is this popular right now in this time and space. You know, what's about people right now, and who are the people that gravitate towards it, because it's a cultural phenomenon. We have less of those now. that, are really big. So why, and be utterly curious about anything that involves people and how they react. That is a skill set that will do you so good. And again, I get that we're all built differently. That's a big part of what I do for a living. Then find somebody in your team who is naturally that way. Their curiosity could be an asset to your organization. Do you have a chief listening officer? That's maybe a role you need, of someone who's really just keeping their eyes and ears on your community, and giving you actionable information, and goes to your events and does experience audits. Like, consider that as a position, in order to then educate that person in behavioral science to take their insights to the next level of saying they pay attention, they have their thumb on the pulse, they understand how humanity works in these big type of archival or arch ways, and they've determined that with this and that we could create the behavioral change we want to create.
I feel like we've talked about this before, that there should be secret shoppers for events.
They're the best.
And,
I've done it.
Yeah.
It's a real thing. I'll tell you when I do it, with trade shows. So I am a strategist. So my work is often done when prior to launch. Here's what you should do, and then I disappear, and then I don't load trucks. I don't unload trucks. But I am asked, because I have that perspective. I've done all this deep research on the attendees to come to events, and it's hard for like conferences to get that, because they just don't understand the value in that. But trade shows get it, because here's how I pitch them. You don't want to give these people bad news that they're doing a bad job in their booth and it's their fault. You want it to come from a third party. So I'll provide you that, like, was reading a Grisham book the whole time, doesn't make eye contact,
casually offered me a squish ball
exactly
every time I walked by.
Yeah, had a candy bowl and low-res photos, no storytelling, didn't connect with me as a person, thought I was beneath them, whatever, right? Like, there are these things that you can do. But in a trade show environment, because there's so many micro events within the event, each booth is kind of its own event, and really the general feeling, like, designing a trade show is very difficult, because it's outside of the majority of the experiences the attendee have are outside of your control as a designer, because they're dictated by the experiences they have in the booths. So it takes a lot of training, which I've never seen anyone being very receptive to, and I've done training and I see that it only affects like 10%. It's a very difficult position to be in when you consider that the participants, majority of their experiential time is spent with people who are not trained well to take advantage of a face-to-face opportunity for trust building, and are trying to move units because that's how they're graded in life. And it's all, it's bad because there's too many moving parts. But a third-party person does provide that opportunity, and they can give it to them in the form of a report of saying, here's how I would, update my strategy next year. And then you try to go for the retention sale in there, as long as it's not too negative and it's like somebody's cousin that you just ratted out. But at least they can blame it on me, this person.
Well, as always, the clock is against us. We've barely scratched the surface.
Sure.
We hit probably 2 of about 46 points that we wanted to get to today.
Yeah.
So we're going to have a part B on this episode. I think we're going to have to come back to this at some point. But before we get into the tips and the resources, is there anything else you want to throw out, lightning round style, as far as design principles?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the biggest thing I would say is to diversify everything that you do, and don't talk about your attendee. Talk about your different types of attendees, and make sure that you're nothing that you're doing is programming one event. And don't think about things like programming tracks for. Again, I'm more in the conference world often than not, so this is my default. But don't think about a marketing track and a sales track, or if it's a networking event, don't think about just these two groups of people, and don't abandon the introverts. Try to really look at how you would program an event based on behaviors and not based on job titles. or based on buyer, seller, that kind of thing, or how do I guard the buyers from the vendors? Like, don't think like that. Maybe find people who are the curious and the whatever, and program for curious people. So the idea of designing events based on behaviors versus designing events based on demographics would be the main thing I would tell you about. Do as many as you can handle, but don't do more than you can handle.
All right. I think we're going to have that be kind of the last word on that subject. For those of you, we dove right in today, so we didn't do our usual softball of if you weren't in the events industry, blah, blah, blah. But you've been on the show so many times. I think the last one was episode 143. So anyone interested in knowing what Nick would be doing if he wasn't in the events industry should go back and listen to some of the previous episodes.
I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, it's probably changed. I know mine has the last couple times that I've done it. If you could pick only one, though, what's your one tip for event planners when it comes to either applying behavioral science or something beyond that? What's your hot tip right these days?
My hot tip is the power of diversity. A lack of diversity can crush a show and make it go away. Optic diversity can, clearly destroy a show from a panel idea. Not having ideas that are coming from different points of view and someone in the room who is a wild card asking, but why do we do it that way? I will say that with disruption at every corner and with as many, with a new generation who has much more of an entrepreneurial spirit, your success and longevity will be defined by your ability to tackle problems in as many different ways as possible.
Nice. All right. And so now, cool resources. What's new and exciting for you in your world? Websites, blogs, books, gadgets, not necessarily related to behavioral science.
I can relate it to behavior. I actually did the homework today. So 3 books I would say that are really great because they apply to live events really well, and they're behavioral science books. One is Predictable Irrationality. Predictably Irrational. The second is Nudge, which is improving decisions about health, wealth, and happiness. But really, it's just about changing behaviors in a way that isn't disruptive or negative. There's a lot of negative ideas around, changing someone's behavior. Like, no, for the better, for the good. And that's what that book talks about. And then there's a book called Naked Statistics, which is stripping the dread from data. If you really want to listen to people in order to apply data, behavioral science, data is your best listening tool because it's listening to scale. So those books would be the ones I would say. From an organization standpoint, there's a group called People Science. Which you can Google them, or I'll give you the link, Brent. And they study behavioral science as it applies to live events, as well as like travel and a few other things. And then I'll give you a couple of names of people that are in the behavior science world that actually do apply it to live events too. But,
absolutely. Yeah. And we'll make sure that those links get into the show notes, as well as the books that you just recommended, Predictably Irrational, Nudge, and Naked Statistics. I'll throw one more in there that's kind of a fairly easy read, but I found very interesting. Not easy read, but it's not like deep science, which is Thinking Fast and Slow. And I'll drop that in there as well.
That's a good one.
As far as what a good book that you can listen to. It was an easy audible read. Let's put it that way. And I found it fascinating. That's getting
for the layperson.
Yeah, how we make decisions based on emotion, and we think that our big brain is doing all the work, but really we make our decision within a fraction of a second. And
that lizard is still in there.
Yeah, and then we come up with reasons for why we made those decisions. All right, we're gonna have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Nick Borelli, for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Where can folks find out more about what you're up to these days?
I'm all over social media. Nick Borelli. I don't hide.
All right. Well, again, thanks so much for joining us. And I want to remind everybody out there that we record this show, Event Icons, live each Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, and you can watch us at www.event-icons.com. How long do we have to keep using the www? At some point, we can remove that, right? It's available the following Tuesday in all your favorite podcast apps like Pocket Cast, iTunes, Google Play. What's the new one that just came out? If If you want us there, we'll be there. Tell us if you want us to be on a particular app, and we'll make sure that we're there. But the best way to join us is live at event-icons.com. There you can see all the show notes. You're going to see the links to all the resources that get shared, all the books, all the links to people that are studying behavioral science. All of that is going to be right there. And most importantly, you can join us in the chat right there on the page. A lot of folks in the chat today just kind of saying hi and sorry I got to leave early, but it's a great discussion and all that kind of good stuff. If you do ever have any questions for our guests, you can drop them in there right on the page. It's great. You can watch and you can type. It's magic. We want to know what you think, so be sure and contact us. Use a hashtag event icons. Tell us what you think. Who should we have on the show? What other icons what aspects of this really could improve your event? Let us know using hashtag event icons. And until next time, we'll see you next time.
Probably next week.
Way to botch that close. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time on Event Icons.
Thank you for joining us for another amazing episode of Hashtag Event Icons.
To catch all the bonus content, resources mentioned, and an invite to our Facebook and LinkedIn groups,
Head to www.event-icons.com. Also, let us know what you thought about this week's episode. Share your biggest takeaway. Just tag your post with hashtag Event Icons. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, right here on Hashtag Event Icons.